Okay. We also have the report of Eusebius that Pandan Pantanaeus, an eminent Christian of Egypt in the late 2nd century, visiting the East, found the Gospel of Matthew, which had been delivered before his coming to some who had knowledge of Christ, to whom Bartholomew, one of the apostles, as it is said, had preached and left them that writing of Matthew in Hebrew characters. This copy, according to Jerome, Pantanaeus took back with him to Alexandria. There is a reason to believe, then, that the situation in Palestine between AD 45 and 50 was a major cause of the widespread missionary journeys of the Nazarene apostles and created the need for setting down the prophecies believed to have been fulfilled by Jesus with some account of his teachings and activities. These records were in Hebrew and had been compiled by Matthew. Paul probably had a copy of the testimony book to which he is referring when he writes to the Corinthians that he had delivered to them what he had himself received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. On the showing of such evidence as we possess, there were written accounts of Jesus within about 15 years of his death. Except as they are reflected in the Gospels, however, these Hebrew sources are lost and the early translations made of them. It is possible, nevertheless, to learn something of the contents and structure of the testimony gospel. Evidently, in presenting the material, a sentence from one prophet was sometimes tacked on to or combined with the words of another prophet. Classic examples are Malachi 3, 1 running on into Isaiah 43 ascribed to Isaiah in Mark 1, 2, 3, and a passage from Zechariah 11, 12 to 13, mixed with some allusion to Jeremiah 32, 6, 9, ascribed to Jeremiah in MT 27, 9. It is not only that the secondary authority is substituted for the primary, but that excerpts from different works are combined to make a continuous quotation. We find that the same thing in Justin's use of the testimonies. For instance, a star shall arise from Jacob, and a flower shall come up from the root of Jesse. The first part is from New 24:17, and the second from Isaiah 11:1, but the sentence reads as a single quotation and is attributed to Isaiah. We may assume, therefore, that this kind of combination appeared in the testimony book. We know now from the recovered Dead Sea Scrolls that a composition of such a book was no Nazarene novelty. It was quite typical of what was being done by the Jewish eclectic groups who prepared a number of biblical anthologies, some of them messianic, with and without interpretation. That interpretation? Making sure it was an interpolation. Interpretation, as well as providing more extended extended explanatory commentaries on books of the Bible. Their oracular employment of the Scriptures was of the same order as that of the Nazarenes. At an early date, the Christian testimony material seems to have been arranged under headings in accordance with an outline of developments. We have a hint of this in Paul's speech before Agrippa in the Acts. I continue unto this day, saying none of these things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come. That the Messiah should suffer, that he should be the first that should rise from the dead, and shew light unto the Jewish people, and to the Gentiles. Justin, some 50 years later than the authorship of the Acts, is even more explicit. In these books, then, of the prophets, we found Jesus, our Messiah, foretold as coming born of a virgin, growing up to man's estate, and healing every disease and every sickness, and raising the dead, and being hated and unrecognized, and crucified, and dying, and rising again, and ascending to heaven, and being called the Son of God. We find it also predicted that certain persons should be sent by him into every nation to publish these things, and that among the Gentiles, rather than among the Jews, men should believe in him. Justin was obviously familiar with an expanded Greek version of the testimonies, taking in much more of what became the Christian story of Jesus. Elsewhere, Justin urges that Christians have not accepted Jesus without being able to produce proof, and asks, with what reason should we believe of a crucified man that he is the firstborn of the unbegotten God, and himself shall pass judgment on the whole human race, unless we had found testimonies concerning him published before he came? He claims that the predictions were made at 5 intervals of time, and this raises the question whether the testimony book had originally or assumed a 5-book structure, which in fact is the literary structure of canonical Matthew. A Jewish tradition has it that Jesus had 5 disciples, whose names are given as Matthai, Naka, Netzer, Buni, and Toda. The first name evidently has Matthew in mind, but the discussion of the passage shows that otherwise individuals are not the subject, but proof texts from the Bible in favor of Jesus, which are met by countertexts. The tradition thus witnesses to a 5-division collection of testimonies associated with Matthew, which Rendell Harris argued convincingly was the form of the testimony book. In further support, it is on record that the work of Papias, who stated that Matthew had compiled the oracles in Hebrew, was also in 5 books and entitled Exposition of the Oracles Relating to the Lord. It may well be the case that the author of canonical Matthew is being more faithful to the spirit and design of the testimony book than any of the other evangelicists, and he may be believed to have been greatly influenced by a Greek version of it. This would account for the gospel being attributed to Matthew. While we are on the earliest sources of information about Jesus, we must revert to the Gospel of Mark. Concerning its origin, Papias had obtained secondhand some particulars on the authority of John the Elder of Ephesus, which are of considerable interest. We quote his statement in full. Mark, having come to the interpreter of Peter, set down accurately as much as he remembered, though not in order, of the things said and done by Christ. For neither did he hear the Lord, nor did he follow him, but afterwards, as I said, followed Peter, who adapted his instructions to the needs of his hearers, but had no design to provide a connected account of the things related to the Lord. So then, Mark made no mistake in setting down some things as he remembered them, for he took care not to omit anything he heard or to include anything false. What Papias is telling us may be slightly elaborated to make it clear. Mark had followed Peter and acted as his interpreter for the reason, no doubt, that Peter could only express himself in Aramaic. Subsequently, and this could be much later, Mark wrote down what he could recall of what Peter had related in his addresses about various things which Jesus had said and done. Such recollections of sayings and incidences could not be arranged in consecutive order, since Peter had introduced them to suit the occasion and had not specified the sequence in which they occurred. How apt is this tradition of applying to canonical Mark? It cannot be denied that to a considerable extent it fits. This gospel is episodal, with little real connection between many of the episodes. It reproduces certain words of Jesus in Aramaic, as Peter may well have quoted them. The style is not literary and conveys the sense of a spoken rather than a written story, told unaffectedly with great economy of words, yet with a rugged charm and convincing Palestinian coloring. In creating this biographical presentation, the author must have depended on some personal source, and the evidence points to this source being Peter. Canonical Mark does not allow us to agree entirely with Papias, because this gospel betrays purposes and tendencies which reflect a situation which arose some years after Peter's death, and attitudes for which Peter could not have been responsible. We shall have more to say about this in the next chapter, but we may point out here that Brandon and others have seen in Mark the reemergence of Pauline Christianity, which for a decade or more before the fall of Jerusalem had lost ground heavily to the Nazarenes. After Paul's arrest about AD 58, church after church of his founding had defected to the doctrine of the Supreme Jerusalem Authority, and in Italy, where it is most probable that Mark was written, and where there were many Jewish Christians, Paul's teaching was strongly opposed. It would seem, however, that Mark was with Paul at the end, and could have been influenced by him. The fall of Jerusalem wrought a great change, and under the new conditions, much of what Paul had stood for could be reasserted and help to formulate a revised Christianity in much the same way as the rabbis after the war formulated and revised Judaism. It could have happened that Mark's gospel, written between AD 75 and 80, was an instrument in bringing about a combination of the Palestinian Petrin doctrine with the more Hellenistic Pauline teaching of Christology. At any rate, the New Testament associates Mark with Peter as well as Paul, and suggests a reconciliation between the Petrine and Pauline positions. We must not, then, be carried away by favorable first impressions of Mark's gospel, since it was performing a function which became essential if Christianity was to survive the defeat of the Jews and the cutting off of communication with the remnant of Nazarene orthodoxy in the East. But it adds greatly to its standing as an authority if it does to an appreciable extent embody remembrances of what had been told by one who had been so close to Jesus as Peter. It is not surprising in these circumstances that the Gospel of Mark should have been hailed by the Gentile church as a singularly precious position. Incidentally, there is a link between Peter and the publication of the testimony book, for tradition has it that it was in the reign of Claudius that Peter came to Rome. When we come to assess the character and worth of the Gospels, it is important to know that behind them is a considerable amount of material about Jesus, which fortunately, because of Roman oppression in Palestine between AD 45 and 55, had been conveyed to other lands before the outbreak of the fatal Jewish revolt against Rome. This material, so far as it was in documentary form, is not available, though there is always the chance that some of it may be recovered. Consequently, while we can be convinced that Jesus really lived and that a good deal reported about him is worthy of credence, we must accept that we are without direct access to the oldest and most reliable sources of information.